Marcus Thompson pushed his maintenance cart down the long hallway of Peterson Air Force Base, the squeaky wheel echoing off the concrete walls. At 52, his weathered hands told stories of decades spent fixing things that others had broken or ignored. The young airman barely glanced his way as he passed, their conversations about weekend plans and video games flowing around him like he was invisible furniture. "Hey, old man, the coffee machine in Building C is acting up again," called out Sergeant Davis, a cocky 20-something with perfectly pressed uniforms and an attitude to match. Marcus simply nodded and made a mental note, adding it to the growing list of repairs that seemed to multiply faster than he could complete them. The base commander, Colonel Harrison, had made it clear during the monthly staff meeting that budget cuts meant doing more with less. Maintenance staff had been reduced by 30%. But somehow the workload had doubled. Marcus didn't complain, though. He never complained. He just showed up every morning at 5:30, grabbed his tools, and got to work. What the young airman didn't know, what Colonel Harrison had never bothered to check, was that Marcus Thompson wasn't just any maintenance worker. 25 years ago, he had been Captain Marcus Thompson, one of the most skilled A-10 Thunderbolt II pilots the Air Force had ever trained. The A-10 Warthog, as it was affectionately known, was a beast of an aircraft designed for close air support and ground attack missions. Flying it required nerves of steel, lightning-fast reflexes, and an intimate understanding of combat tactics that most pilots could only dream of achieving. Marcus had logged over 2,000 flight hours in the A-10, including 3 combat deployments to the Middle East. He had saved countless ground troops with precision strikes, earned a Distinguished Flying Cross, and had been on track for promotion to Major when everything changed. A training accident that wasn't his fault, a medical review board that questioned his fitness for duty, and a series of bureaucratic decisions that seemed designed to push him toward early retirement had effectively ended his flying career. But Marcus loved the Air Force too much to leave entirely. When his flying days ended, he applied for a maintenance position, figuring that at least he could stay close to the aircraft he loved. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now spent his days fixing the very planes he once piloted with unmatched skill. The morning routine was always the same. Marcus would arrive before dawn, check his assignment board, and begin his rounds. Today's list included the malfunctioning coffee machine, a broken air conditioning unit in the officers' quarters, and routine maintenance on several vehicles in the motor pool. Simple work for someone with his background, but work that needed doing nonetheless. As he wheeled his cart toward Building C, Marcus passed the flight line, where several A-10 seconds sat in various stages of preparation and maintenance. His steps slowed involuntarily as he approached the aircraft that had once been his second home. The distinctive twin engines, the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon mounted in the nose, the titanium armor that could withstand incredible punishment. Every detail was burned into his memory. Staff Sergeant Williams, one of the younger aircraft mechanics, was struggling with an engine panel on one of the Warthogs. Marcus watched for a moment as the young man fumbled with a wrench that was clearly the wrong size for the job. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly. "That's a 15mm bolt. You need the metric set, not the standard." Williams looked up, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Yeah? How would you know, old man? You fix toilets and coffee machines." Marcus felt the familiar sting of dismissal, but kept his expression neutral. "Just a suggestion. The metric tools are in the red toolbox by the hangar door." Williams shrugged and went back to his struggle with the wrong wrench. Marcus continued on his way, pushing down the frustration that bubbled up whenever he encountered such situations. He had learned long ago that trying to assert his expertise only led to skepticism, and sometimes outright hostility from younger personnel, who saw him as nothing more than a maintenance worker past his prime. The coffee machine in Building C was indeed malfunctioning, spitting out lukewarm brown water that barely resembled coffee. Marcus diagnosed the problem quickly: a clogged internal filter and a malfunctioning heating element. Within 30 minutes, he had the machine producing steaming cups of rich, dark coffee that had several airmen asking how he had worked such magic. "Just know my way around machines," Marcus replied with a modest smile, packing up his tools. The rest of the morning passed in similar fashion. Marcus moved from job to job with quiet efficiency, his decades of military training evident in the methodical way he approached each task. But underneath the calm exterior, he couldn't shake the feeling that his skills and experience were being wasted on mundane repairs when he could be contributing so much more. During his lunch break, Marcus sat alone in the maintenance shop, eating a sandwich and reading a technical manual about the latest A-10 upgrades. Even though he no longer flew, he made it a point to stay current with aircraft developments. Knowledge, he had learned, was the one thing that couldn't be taken away from him. Still dreaming about being a pilot, Marcus? The voice belonged to Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a career maintenance professional who had worked with Marcus for the past 8 years. Rodriguez was one of the few people on base who knew about Marcus's background, having served long enough to remember when Captain Thompson was still flying. "Just staying informed," Marcus replied, closing the manual. Rodriguez sat down across from him, his expression serious. "You know, I've been thinking, with all the budget cuts and personnel shortages, maybe it's time to let some people know what you're really capable of. The new pilots coming in could use someone with your experience to mentor them." Marcus shook his head. "That ship has sailed, Chief. I'm just maintenance now. Besides, they've got their own instructors and training programs. They don't need advice from someone who hasn't flown in 15 years. "Maybe not," Rodriguez said. "But experience like yours doesn't just disappear. One day, this base might need every qualified person they can get." Marcus appreciated the sentiment. But he had made peace with his current role years ago. Or at least, he told himself he had. The truth was more complicated. Every time he saw an A-10 taxi down the runway, every time he heard the distinctive sound of the GAU-8 cannon during training exercises, a part of him ached with longing for the cockpit he would never see again. The afternoon brought a new challenge that would test Marcus's patience even more than usual. A group of visiting dignitaries, including a congressman who served on the Defense Appropriations Committee, were scheduled for a tour of the base. Colonel Harrison had stressed to all personnel that everything needed to be perfect, with special emphasis on making sure all the aircraft on the flight line were spotless and mission-ready. Marcus was assigned to ensure that all the support equipment was properly positioned and functional. As he moved between aircraft, checking fuel carts, hydraulic units, and other ground support equipment, he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. "Sir, I'm not sure we should include the A-10 demonstration in today's program," one of the junior officers was saying to Colonel Harrison. "Lieutenant Peterson called in sick, and he was supposed to be our pilot for the congressional tour." Colonel Harrison's face darkened. "What do you mean we don't have a pilot? This demonstration is crucial for maintaining funding for the A-10 program. Find me another pilot, immediately." "Sir, all our other qualified A-10 pilots are either deployed or on leave. The next available pilot won't be back until next week." Marcus continued his work, but his attention was completely focused on the conversation unfolding nearby. The A-10 program had been under scrutiny for years, with critics questioning its relevance in modern warfare. A successful demonstration for the visiting congressman could mean continued funding and support. A canceled demonstration, especially due to personnel shortages, could provide ammunition for those seeking to cut the program. "This is unacceptable," Colonel Harrison was saying, his voice rising with frustration. "We have millions of dollars worth of aircraft sitting on this flight line, and you're telling me we can't find one qualified pilot for a simple demonstration flight?" Marcus felt his heart rate increase as an idea formed in his mind. It was crazy, probably career-ending if it backfired, but the A-10 program meant too much to him to watch it suffer because of a staffing shortage. He had spent too many years watching from the sidelines, while others made decisions about aircraft and programs he understood better than almost anyone. He finished checking the last piece of ground equipment and slowly pushed his cart back toward the maintenance building, his mind racing with possibilities. The visiting dignitaries weren't due for another 2 hours. If he was going to act, it would have to be soon. In the maintenance shop, Marcus sat at his small desk and pulled out a sheet of paper. With careful handwriting, he began composing what might be the most important memo of his post-flying career. It was a long shot, but Chief Rodriguez had been right about one thing. Experience like his didn't just disappear. As he wrote, Marcus could hear the sound of jet engines in the distance, reminding him of all the flights he would never take and all the missions he would never fly. But maybe, just maybe, there was still one more flight left in him after all. The memo was simple and direct, just like Marcus himself. But it contained information that would shock Colonel Harrison and change the course of the day in ways no one could have predicted. Marcus folded the paper carefully, stood up from his desk, and began walking toward the base commander's office, his heart pounding with anticipation and fear. Colonel Harrison was pacing behind his desk when his secretary announced that Marcus Thompson from maintenance was requesting to see him. The colonel's day had gone from bad to worse, and he wasn't in the mood for reports about broken equipment or budget requests for new tools. "Send him in, but make it quick," Harrison said, glancing at his watch. The congressional delegation would arrive in less than 90 minutes, and he still had no solution to his pilot shortage. Marcus entered the office with his usual quiet demeanor, holding a single sheet of paper. Colonel Harrison had seen him around the base for years but had never paid much attention to the soft-spoken maintenance worker. To Harrison, Marcus was just another face in the crowd of enlisted personnel who kept the base running behind the scenes. "Sir, I understand you're looking for an A-10 pilot for today's demonstration," Marcus began, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "Thompson, I don't have time for maintenance issues right now. Can't this wait until tomorrow?" Harrison replied, barely looking up from the papers scattered across his desk. "Sir, with respect, I'm not here about maintenance. I'm here about the pilot shortage." Marcus placed the memo on the colonel's desk. "I believe I can help with your demonstration." Harrison finally looked up, his expression shifting from irritation to confusion. "What are you talking about, Thompson? The demonstration requires a qualified A-10 pilot, not a maintenance worker." "Sir, I am a qualified A-10 pilot. Or rather, I was Captain Marcus Thompson, United States Air Force, with over 2,000 flight hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt II." Marcus stood at attention as he spoke, his entire bearing changing from that of a humble maintenance worker to that of a military officer. The memo in Harrison's hands contained Marcus's complete service record, including his flight certifications, combat decorations, and training qualifications. As the colonel read, his expression shifted from confusion to disbelief to amazement. "This says you have 3 combat tours, a distinguished flying cross, and were qualified as an A-10 instructor pilot," Harrison said, looking up at Marcus with new eyes. "How is it possible that a pilot with your credentials is working in maintenance?" Marcus explained the medical review, the training accident, and the series of bureaucratic decisions that had ended his flying career. He spoke without bitterness, simply stating facts as if describing someone else's life. But Harrison could see the pain in the older man's eyes, the loss of something that had obviously meant everything to him. "Your medical clearance was revoked 15 years ago," Harrison noted, scanning the documents. "Even if everything you're telling me is true, you're not current on flight status. I can't authorize you to fly without proper medical and flight certifications." "Sir, my last medical examination was actually only 3 years ago when I applied for a civilian pilot's license," Marcus replied, producing additional paperwork from his pocket. "I passed all requirements and maintain currency in civilian aircraft. As for A-10 specific currency, I've kept up with all technical updates and procedural changes through my maintenance work. I know these aircraft better than most people know their cars." Harrison studied the documents more carefully. Everything appeared legitimate, but the implications were staggering. He had been searching for a qualified pilot while one had been working under his nose for 8 years, fixing coffee machines and unclogging toilets. "Even if I could somehow authorize this, which is highly questionable, the demonstration isn't just a simple flight around the pattern. The congressman specifically requested to see the A-10's ground attack capabilities. That means low-level maneuvering, simulated target runs, and precision flying that requires current proficiency." Marcus met the colonel's gaze steadily. "Sir, I flew 847 combat missions in the A-10. I've engaged real targets under real combat conditions. A demonstration flight, even with aggressive maneuvering, would be well within my capabilities." The office fell silent except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Harrison found himself facing a decision that could make or break his career. If he authorized this flight and something went wrong, the consequences would be catastrophic. But if he didn't, the A-10 program might lose crucial congressional support. Thompson, what you're suggesting is completely irregular. I'd need to contact the wing commander, possibly the Pentagon, to authorize something like this. We don't have time for that kind of coordination. Sir, emergency flight authorizations can be issued by base commanders under special circumstances, Marcus replied quietly. Regulation 11-202 allows for temporary flight status restoration when mission requirements exceed available resources and the pilot demonstrates adequate proficiency. Harrison raised an eyebrow. You've done your homework. Sir, I've had 15 years to study regulations and hope for a second chance. Before Harrison could respond, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was the wing commander calling from headquarters. Harrison answered with some trepidation, knowing this conversation would determine the fate of the entire demonstration. Colonel Harrison, I just got word from Washington about today's congressional visit. The Pentagon is very interested in the outcome of this demonstration. The A-10 program faces significant budget pressure, and Congressman Daniels chairs the subcommittee that controls our funding. Whatever you do today could determine whether the A-10 remains operational for the next decade. The pressure in the room seemed to intensify with every word. Harrison looked at Marcus, who remained standing at attention, waiting for a decision that would either vindicate 15 years of patience or confirm that his flying days were truly over. Sir, I understand the importance, Harrison replied to his superior. We're exploring all options to ensure the demonstration proceeds as planned. After hanging up, Harrison walked to his window and looked out at the flight line where the A-10 sat waiting. In the distance, he could see the maintenance crews making final preparations, unaware that their colleague might soon be climbing into the cockpit of one of those aircraft. Thompson, if I authorize this, you understand that you'll be flying alone. No instructor, pilot, no chase aircraft, just you and the A-10. If anything goes wrong, it's on both our heads. Yes, sir. I wouldn't expect otherwise. Harrison made his decision with the conviction of a commander who had learned to trust his instincts. All right, Thompson. I'm issuing you a temporary flight authorization for one demonstration flight. But first, I want you to complete a thorough aircraft inspection and brief me on your planned flight profile. And Thompson? Yes, sir. If you so much as scratch the paint on that aircraft, I'll personally make sure you spend the rest of your career cleaning latrines. For the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself a genuine smile. Understood, sir. Thank you for this opportunity. As Marcus left the colonel's office, word began to spread through the base, with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. The maintenance worker was going to fly the A-10. Within minutes, airmen were gathering near the flight line, some skeptical, others curious, all eager to witness what promised to be either a triumph or a disaster. Marcus walked to the aircraft with a different stride than he had used as a maintenance worker. His shoulders were straighter, his head held higher, and there was a confidence in his movement that hadn't been there when he was pushing a cart full of tools. This was Captain Thompson returning to his element. The A-10 assigned for the demonstration was tail number 78-0665. A veteran aircraft with thousands of flight hours and a history of reliable service. Marcus began his pre-flight inspection with the thoroughness of a pilot who understood that his life depended on the aircraft's condition. But this time, his inspection was informed by years of maintaining these same systems. He knew not just what to check, but why each component might fail, and how to detect early warning signs that younger pilots might miss. Staff Sergeant Williams, the same mechanic who had dismissed Marcus's advice earlier that morning, watched in amazement as the maintenance worker conducted a pre-flight inspection with the expertise of a seasoned test pilot. Hey Thompson, Williams called out. What's going on? Since when do maintenance guys do pilot inspections? Marcus paused in his examination of the aircraft's control surfaces and looked at the young sergeant. Since when do mechanics ignore advice about using the right tools for the job? The crowd around the aircraft grew larger as Marcus completed his inspection. Some of the observers were base personnel who had worked with him for years and couldn't believe what they were seeing. Others were visiting dignitaries who had arrived early and were curious about the unusual pre-flight activities. Congressman Daniels, a former Navy pilot himself, approached Colonel Harrison as they watched Marcus work. "Colonel, your pilot seems very thorough. How long has he been flying the A-10? Harrison hesitated, realizing that the full truth might be hard to believe. "Sir, Captain Thompson has extensive A-10 experience. He's been with this base for many years." It wasn't technically a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. Harrison decided that explanations could wait until after the demonstration was over. Marcus completed his inspection and approached Colonel Harrison for his briefing. Standing beside the aircraft that had been his passion for decades, he outlined a flight plan that would showcase the A-10's unique capabilities while remaining within safe parameters for a pilot returning to currency. "Sir, I'll demonstrate the aircraft's low-speed maneuverability with some tight turns around the traffic pattern, followed by a simulated attack run on the target range. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon won't be fired, but I can demonstrate the aircraft's stability during attack profiles. Finally, I'll perform a tactical approach and landing that shows the A-10's short-field capabilities." Colonel Harrison nodded, impressed by the professionalism of the briefing. "Approved. You're cleared for takeoff when ready." As Marcus climbed into the cockpit, 15 years of separation from the aircraft he loved seemed to melt away. Every switch, every gauge, every control surface was exactly where his hands expected them to be. The muscle memory built over thousands of hours of flight time came rushing back as he began the engine start procedures. The distinctive whine of the A-10's twin turbofan engines filled the air, drawing even more spectators to the flight line. Marcus ran through his pre-takeoff checks with the precision of a pilot preparing for combat. While outside the aircraft, a crowd of skeptics and believers waited to see if the maintenance worker could really fly the Warthog. The moment Marcus released the brakes and began his takeoff roll, something magical happened. The doubts, the whispered conversations, the skeptical looks from the crowd all faded into insignificance. The A-10 Thunderbolt II responded to his touch like a faithful horse welcoming back its rider after a long absence. As the aircraft lifted off the runway, Marcus felt a surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. For 15 years, he had watched others fly while he remained earthbound, fixing the very machines he longed to pilot. Now, climbing into the clear blue sky above Peterson Air Force Base, he was finally home again. The flight controls felt natural in his hands, as if no time had passed since his last flight. The A-10's legendary stability and forgiving flight characteristics made the transition back to flying easier than he had dared to hope. But Marcus wasn't content to simply fly straight and level. He had a demonstration to perform, and years of reputation to rebuild in the span of a single flight. At 2,000 feet above ground level, Marcus began the demonstration with a series of tight turns that showed off the A-10's exceptional low-speed maneuverability. Unlike faster fighter jets that required large turning radii and high speeds, the Warthog could turn on a dime and loiter over the battlefield like a bird of prey. On the ground, the crowd watched in stunned silence as the aircraft performed maneuvers that seemed impossible for such a large machine. Congressman Daniels, who had flown Navy F-18 seconds during his military service, turned to Colonel Harrison with obvious amazement. "Colonel, your pilot is flying that aircraft like it's a part of his body. I've never seen such precise control of an A-10. How long did you say he's been with your unit?" Colonel Harrison found himself in the awkward position of having to explain the truth. "Sir, that's Captain Marcus Thompson. He's actually been working in maintenance here for the past 8 years, but before that, he was one of our most experienced A-10 pilots." "Working in maintenance?" Congressman Daniels's expression shifted from admiration to confusion. "You mean to tell me that one of your most qualified pilots has been fixing toilets and coffee machines?" Before Harrison could respond, Marcus began the second phase of his demonstration. Banking the aircraft into a steep diving turn, he lined up for a simulated attack run on the base's target range. The A-10's nose dropped toward the ground in what looked to untrained observers like a controlled crash. This was where Marcus's experience truly showed. The attack profile he flew was textbook perfect, approaching the target at a shallow angle that maximized the time his guns would be on target, while minimizing exposure to theoretical enemy fire. Even without firing the massive GAU-8 cannon, the precision of his approach was obvious to anyone who understood air-to-ground tactics. Staff Sergeant Williams, who had dismissed Marcus as just maintenance that morning, stood with his mouth open, as the A-10 pulled out of its attack dive with G-forces that would have left less experienced pilots struggling to maintain consciousness. The aircraft climbed smoothly back to pattern altitude, where Marcus set up for the final phase of his demonstration. The tactical approach in landing was perhaps the most impressive part of the entire flight. Marcus brought the A-10 inches steep and fast, then used the aircraft's powerful air brakes and robust landing gear to execute a short-field landing that put the aircraft exactly where he wanted it on the runway. The landing was so smooth that some observers weren't sure the aircraft had actually touched down until they saw the landing gear compress. As Marcus taxied back to the flight line, the crowd of onlookers had grown to include nearly every person on base who could get away from their duties. Word of the maintenance workers' flight had spread through the base like wildfire, and everyone wanted to see the conclusion of what had become the most talked-about event in recent memory. When Marcus shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, the silence that greeted him was deafening. For a moment, nobody seemed to know how to react to what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, one person began to clap, others joined in, and within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding with an enthusiasm usually reserved for airshow performances. Congressman Daniels was the first to approach Marcus as he completed his post-flight inspection. "Captain Thompson, that was an absolutely outstanding demonstration. I've seen a lot of military pilots in my time, but rarely have I witnessed such mastery of an aircraft." "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotions churning inside him. "The A-10 is an exceptional aircraft. It makes average pilots look good, and good pilots look exceptional. Don't sell yourself short, Captain. What I just saw was exceptional piloting, period." The congressman turned to Colonel Harrison. "Colonel, we need to talk about how your personnel are being utilized. It seems to me that having a pilot of this caliber working in maintenance represents a serious misallocation of resources." Colonel Harrison nodded, already thinking about the conversations he would need to have with his superiors. "Sir, I agree completely. Captain Thompson's situation is something we'll be addressing immediately." As the crowd began to disperse and the visiting dignitaries moved on to other parts of their tour, Marcus found himself standing alone beside the A-10, running his hand along the aircraft's skin like a man touching something precious he thought he had lost forever. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez approached with a grin that seemed to stretch from ear to ear. "So, Marcus, still think that ship has sailed?" Marcus looked at his old friend and supervisor, then back at the aircraft that had just carried him back to a part of himself he thought was gone forever. "Maybe not all ships, Chief. Maybe some of them just take longer to come back to port." The aftermath of the demonstration flight created ripples that extended far beyond Peterson Air Force Base. Within hours, reports of the maintenance worker turned pilot had reached the Pentagon, where senior officers began asking hard questions about how such a situation had been allowed to develop. The investigation that followed revealed systemic problems in how the Air Force managed its human resources. Marcus's case was not isolated. Across the service, experienced personnel were being underutilized due to bureaucratic inflexibility and a failure to consider individual circumstances when making career decisions. Within 2 weeks of his demonstration flight, Marcus received orders reassigning him to the base's A-10 training squadron as an instructor pilot. The medical and administrative hurdles that had seemed insurmountable for years were suddenly resolved with a speed that amazed everyone involved. It seemed that when the Air Force wanted to move quickly, it could overcome any obstacle. The young pilots Marcus began training were initially skeptical of learning from someone they had seen pushing a maintenance cart just weeks before. But that skepticism disappeared the moment they experienced his teaching in the cockpit. Marcus had a gift for explaining complex concepts in simple terms, and his combat experience gave weight to every lesson he taught. Staff Sergeant Williams was one of the first to seek out Marcus after his return to flying status. The young mechanic found his former maintenance colleague in the squadron ready room, reviewing lesson plans for the next day's training flights. "Sir," Williams began awkwardly, "I owe you an apology. When you tried to help me with that engine panel, I should have listened. I had no idea who you were." Marcus looked up from his papers with a gentle expression. "Sergeant, you had no reason to know my background, but here's something I learned during my years in maintenance. Everyone has something to teach, regardless of their rank or position. The trick is being open enough to learn from anyone. The lesson extended far beyond Williams. The entire base had been reminded that people are often much more than they appear to be on the surface. The quiet maintenance worker who fixed their problems without fanfare had been a highly decorated combat pilot all along. It made everyone wonder what other hidden talents and experiences might be walking among them unrecognized. Marcus's story also had a profound impact on Air Force personnel policies. His case was studied at the highest levels, leading to reforms in how the service handled career transitions and medical reviews. New procedures were implemented to ensure that qualified personnel weren't lost to bureaucratic oversights, and systems were put in place to better match people's skills with the service's needs. 6 months after his return to flying status, Marcus was promoted to major and given command of the base's A-10 training program. The promotion ceremony was attended by many of the same people who had watched his demonstration flight, including Congressman Daniels, who had become a strong advocate for both Marcus and the A-10 program. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came when Marcus received a letter from a young pilot he had trained, now deployed overseas and flying combat missions in the same type of aircraft Marcus had mastered decades before. The pilot wrote about how Marcus's teaching had prepared him for the challenges of real combat, and how the lessons learned from someone who had been there made all the difference. Standing in his new office, looking out at the flight line where A-10 seconds prepared for training missions, Marcus reflected on the strange journey that had brought him full circle. He had never stopped being a pilot, even when he was fixing coffee machines and unclogging toilets. The skills, the knowledge, the passion, they had all been there, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The maintenance cart still sat in the shop where he had left it that day, now serving as an unofficial monument to the importance of looking beyond surface appearances. New personnel were often told the story of the maintenance worker who could fly the Warthog, and the lesson that everyone deserves respect regardless of their current position. Marcus Thompson had proven that skills and experience don't disappear just because circumstances change. Sometimes they lie dormant, waiting for the right opportunity to shine again. His story became a reminder that in a world quick to categorize and dismiss people based on their current roles, the most extraordinary capabilities might be hidden in the most ordinary places. The A-10 Thunderbolt II continued to serve with distinction, its future more secure thanks in part to the demonstration flight that had showcased its capabilities to congressional decision-makers. But more importantly, Marcus's story had reminded the Air Force that its greatest assets weren't just the aircraft in the hangars or the technology in the computers. They were the people who served, regardless of what job they happened to be doing at any given moment. In the end, Marcus Thompson's journey from dismissed maintenance worker to respected instructor pilot became more than just a personal triumph. It became a lesson about the value of perseverance, the importance of recognizing hidden potential, and the truth that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to soar once again.